Food is more than just what's on our plate. It's the places where it's grown, it's the people who grow it, and so much more. Join me, Janice Person, your host, on Grounded by the Farm every other week as we talk about the foods we love. Often I find the excitement of taking in new ideas leads me to more, and I find myself reading popular press, maybe watching some documentaries or TV shows or movies. I listen to podcasts as I get into things a bit deeper. And although this show usually is me doing those first-person interviews and research for myself, this week instead, I wanted to take a turn with the recent episodes of the Gila River people talking about foods and farms in that Arizona area. I ended up picking up a new book based on the suggestion of my friend Colleen Newvine. So Colleen had recently been reading a book called Braiding Sweetgrass, and it was all about some of the things that happened in Native America as people were moving around areas. It's a personal memoir, all kinds of things. So I'm still in the process of listening to that book, which was a great book to listen to because the author tells her story and there's sort of a poetic way about the way she tells it. And as I did that, as I was thinking about that, I wanted to share some of the books that I typically keep handy that I really enjoyed. Some of them are in print, some are audio books. But I have a lot of books. I love them. Some are currently in boxes because I have outgrown all the shelves, and occasionally I have to go and get rid of some or put some in boxes or whatever. But there are some books that never get taken away. So they're in the bedroom, they're in the guest room, so that if I have friends over, they may be able to just kind of browse through them. Or some of them are audiobooks, like I mentioned. And so they're always on my phone, ready for me to share with friends who ask if I've read a book on a certain subject or something. So I thought what we would do today, instead of an interview topic, we're going to talk about books that connect really in this food and farm space that I have found so intriguing that I recommend them to others. And I would love to know what books you would put on this list. I do, like, as I said, have lots of other books, but these are kind of like the 9 or 10 that sort of rise up to the top in this food and farm space. And I didn't want to tone it down too small because I think a lot of people are going to be interested in reading different kinds of books. So all of these are nonfiction. So I did do that one way of eliminating. But some of them are far more on the food side. Some are things that I pick up and browse through and get inspiration from. Some are things that keep you absolutely enthralled for the entire process, and you have to go page by page, sentence by sentence, and take it all in. And some I've actually read twice already. So if that's cool with you guys, we're just going to go ahead and start. And we're going to start with more farm related or growing food pieces, and we'll move through and ultimately land on some more food related. I will have all the books linked with affiliate codes wherever like if there's a site where I can get a tiny bit of payment off of the fact that you want to buy it because I recommend it. Those will be in there, but some of them, my bet is I may have to find a different way of purchasing them. So let's go ahead and get started with one that I listened to. And it's somebody I know who wrote it. So some of you may be familiar with a Washington Post columnist named Tamar Haspel. So a year and a half ago or so, she published her book. It's called To Boldly Grow, Finding Joy, Adventure, and Dinner in Your Own Backyard. It's an incredible first-person story of Tamar and her husband, Kevin. They were living in New York. They were trying to produce more. And next thing you know, they are out on Cape Cod and they are raising the vast majority of their food. And it's a little bit funny because, like, how do you go from living in New York, in Manhattan, to something like that? It seems so absurd. However, she's not the only one who's done it, right? Like, there's lots of things to learn along the way, and she shares a lot of those lessons. It's a lot to me when I was listening and reading it. It was a lot like my brother's venture in Ohio, right? Like, the kinds of things you learn, the kind of things you begin to think through about, here's how much that takes versus here's how easy something is. I will just say, in food production, most things are not simple. Even things like foraging take some time. And so Tamar talks about all those kind of things. She talks about, fishing and the role that played since they were on the water. She talks about oyster fishing. She talks about raising oysters. I don't know if it's oyster fishing. That was wrong. Anyway, there you go. Oyster beds, managing oyster beds. She talks about hunting and that, she and Kevin have found they want to have that piece of their own experience and that connection to what they're eating, as well as growing lots of things. And she talks about finding which things grow better and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, it's a really easy read or listen. I highly recommend it. Lots of people have been interested in, maybe I'll learn to do a bit more on the farming side and food production side for myself. You may want to start out with just containers and do container gardening. That's fine. That's usually where I am, but you can go a lot deeper if you like. All right. The second book I want to talk about, it's Tomorrow's Table, and it's written by two university professors. But I do not want you to think in any way it's an academic adventure. Not at all. It's called Tomorrow's Table. It's written by Pam Ronald and her husband, Raul Adamczyk. I hope I'm saying names right on all of these. It's going to be worse later because I know Pam and I've met Raul once. But anyway, Tomorrow's Table. And it's really talking about organic farming, genetics, the future of food. And part of what makes me so excited about it is that Pam and Raul have very different sort of roles in the university system. They're at UC Davis. And Pam teaches on the genetics side. She works with students that do a lot of really in-depth PhD level kinds of research in the world of plant genetics. And Raul is a organic farmer and teaches classes in that vein and sustainability. And they learn so much working together, but it's not an either or for them or for me. Like, to me, there are a lot of different things that we can take in. It is kind of fun because I actually get a small shout out in the book, but she goes through and talks about a lot of the different pieces that she's learned about in the world of science and the world of farming. And it's a very easy read. So that's why I wanted to make sure I told you, don't think it's academic. She does talk about things like genetic engineering and things too. And because she works with people in education so often, it's very accessible. I will tell you, there's two different versions. The latest version, the one that's been most updated, has beets on the cover. So if you look for the book, look for that second edition because it has been updated and improved upon. Even get a used copy if you want. It's been out for several years, so it's not a brand new book. All right. So the next one I want to talk about in this farming segment is really a little bit deeper in the science. And I've got two that are deeper in the science that I want to talk to you about. I'm trying to give you a number of choices, and they're both biographical in some ways. So the first is The Wizard and the Prophet. It's by Charles C. Mann. And the book is about two very different paths towards food and production and sort of the realm in the 70s. And so that is talking about Norman Borlaug, who was considered the father of the Green Revolution, and William Voigt, who's considered the father of, I think, environmentalism and some of those pieces. He was really an important figure in the development of that ecological mindset. What's interesting here is I think sometimes people think they have to pick one or the other, and you definitely may identify more with one of the mindsets or one of the pathways than the other one. But I don't think you have to pick either or, and I think that goes along with Pam's book, Tomorrow's Table. So, the fourth book we're talking about is The Code Breaker. The subhead on that is Jennifer Doudna, Gene Editing and the Future of the Human Race. It's by Walter Isaacson. It's probably 2 years old or something. It is a really intriguing story about what all is going on in the space of gene editing. That is a technology a lot of people don't know about. Sometimes it's called by CRISPR. A lot of times people think about the human health implications. You know, my sister, I remember her having a student who had sickle cell, and we all loved the idea that maybe you could take that one part of the DNA and maybe clip the problem with the cell formations and the pain that causes and things like that. There's a lot of research in that area. But this is talking about how it really started moving early on. It goes through part of the arrival of COVID and sort of what all this technology is. Some of the key players. To me, it was really interesting, and it does let me access science a bit more than getting too deep in the science. All right, fifth book. Still farm related, but kind of food related too. It's talking about the fate of food. The subhead on that one is What We'll Eat in a Bigger, Hotter, Smarter World. The author is Amanda Little. What I find especially exciting about this book is it really helps us understand in that climate space with climate change. That is one of the issues that's facing food production. But also one of the things that's going to make a big difference is just that we have more and more people on the planet. So the world is getting bigger. It's getting hotter. And in at least some parts of the world, it's getting smarter. Seriously, though, it talks about some of the different things to consider. And I really find, the issue of food waste and some of those areas especially intriguing. This is another one I listened to, and it was a nice, easy listen. It's a shorter book than the two previous ones I mentioned. So The Wizard and the Prophet and The Code Breaker, I mentioned that those were both, deeper into the science. Part of the reason they can do that is because it's a much heftier book. And so they're a commitment if you're going to listen to them or read them. But I highly suggest you do. And, taking a chapter or two a day, it's doable. It's easy. All right. So let's move on to 6, The Food Explorer by Dan Stone. This really is in the food-focused world. This is one for people who are intrigued by native foods, especially. Finding out where some of your favorite foods are native to or not is going to blow your mind, or at least it did for me. There was a gentleman named David Fairchild who worked for the USDA, and it was forever ago, and it talks about, decades ago. It talks about how he was in the U.S. and was interested in finding other foods that would grow here, that would thrive here, that people here could find nutritional value from, that we could access from recipes and things like that. And so if you're a travel person, you will absolutely love this book. Travel and food really go together for me. And Dan does a good job of putting this together. You get to sort of know the environment that we're talking about, like the idea that the U.S. one time didn't have avocados easily accessible or something. So there's a great history element to it as well. I'm a huge fan. It's a really interesting book. All right, now 7. This one is one that that I've known about and I've read off and on for years, and that's why it stays handy. I will admit I did not sit down and read it all at once. I actually have some challenges with reading. I love it, but I do have some challenges with it sometimes. But this is one that really goes into that history side of things that I just mentioned with the Food Explorer. And that book is called Cuisine and Empire. And it is cooking world history. And it goes through, Rachel Loudon is the author of that. She was at the University of Texas. She's now in Kentucky. And originally from the UK, she spent time in Hawaii and Mexico, and I'm not sure where all else. So she's got a great kind of a resume of where all she's been, and she's pulled a lot of that kind of information along with food history into this book. And it really does sort of talk about some of the great cuisines we find out there. Like if you think about where grain came in versus some of the other things like more fruits and all of that. At one time, all we were worried about was getting enough calories so that we weren't hungry all the time, because if you're hungry all the time, you're always looking for food. Cuisine and Empire is a good book on kind of working through some of that. So highly recommend it. It's through the University of California Press. Okay. And now the last few books that I have to recommend, I keep them close by for two incredibly different reasons. So first, I'll talk to you about a set of books that I find as a Southerner with food are especially exciting. There's an author, she's amazing. Edna Lewis was her name. And she wrote two different books. So one was The Taste of Country Cooking. And it is a cookbook, but it's so much more than a cookbook. It's talking about seasons and the different kinds of things that we do in the Deep South. And you read it and you're inspired as well as given a recipe. And I love that you can find that combination of things. The other one of her books that I really want to recommend is In Pursuit of Flavor. And those two books, they kind of go hand in hand on talking about, seasonality. A lot of us want to eat foods that are more in season, that maybe have a smaller footprint and things along that line, a little more local foods. But Edna Lewis is a great resource on some of that. And you will find, things like peas and beans and things like that are really important parts of her books. But you can tell she's Southern because she's going to absolutely recommend all the things on the tomatoes and pickling and all those kind of things. And then finally, the final book that I want to recommend is one that you're going to need to be a food nerd for this. I'm just going to admit it on the front end. It is not something many people are going to think they need to have in their house, but I keep it close by because in today's world, I find you can hear things online and not really know what's true or not true. And what is your big reference book for figuring things out? And if you don't have one, then I'm going to give you one. And it is one of those books that occasionally I'll read a section of it because I have something specific on my mind. But it goes through and it really outlines nutritional topics. It's actually published by the American Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. The name of the book I have not mentioned yet, which is crazy, is The Complete Food and Nutrition Guide. And it's like 3 inches thick. I mean, it is probably a textbook for a lot of people. However, it also is something that I know has been vetted not only by the dietitian who wrote it, but lots of other dietitians have signed on to it because of the in-depth kind of work that's been done here and the accuracy of this nutritional information. It has been updated. The copy I have is the 5th edition. I'm not sure if there's a 6th, but they're routinely trying to get it updated and revised as science goes a little bit deeper and you better understand some things. It is one of those books that I will tell you, it's got a lot of practical information in there. And I think it's easy in today's world to get pulled into various topics of, whether it's wellness or nutrition or just because maybe you're moving from your teenage years to years where maybe a little bit more weight would stay on your body and maybe you're not as active anymore. And it does talk about the preventing and managing some of the health concerns. So, let's talk about food allergies. If you're in a world where some of those things are an issue, whether it's gluten or dairy or whatever, this is a really good book for that. It also talks about, some of the things you might need to consider if you have an ongoing issue like heart disease or diabetes or some of those kind of things. It's just a good book that I think you can count on, and I've gotten recommendations for that from a lot of dietitians. And so it is not something that you're going to sit down and just, wow, I'm so excited, I got to keep reading. But some of the other books were that way. And somehow I forgot to put this book on the list, but it's always out, and I've even written a review of it on the website. And I pulled the book here to do it. And it's a great one for me to make the last recommendation. The book I mean is We Are Each Other's Harvest, and it's celebrating African American farmers, land, and legacy. It's by Natalie Bazile. Natalie wrote the fiction book Queen Sugar, but in this book, she actually interviews a number of African American farmers, particularly in the South. But there are some in other areas, and you get to hear their stories. I listened to the audiobook because I was traveling a lot when it first came out, and I didn't want to wait for time that I could sit down and really read it and think about it and stuff. These interviews are interspersed with sort of poetry and writings by various other people. She makes that very clear. But the audiobook was a little bit more challenging for me because you have one person reading it and there's so many stories that are told in other people's voices. And so my mind, as an audio visual learner, it just kind of complicated things for me. There are beautiful photographs in here too, and you're going to meet some great folks like Cliff at Straw Hats Farm in North Carolina. And we've had our own Kamal Bell has been on the show previously. He's interviewed in here and stuff. So I highly recommend this. I don't know why when I started getting ready to record this episode, how indeed I had forgotten to put it on the list because I had the book with me. And I love that it gets to then be the last book that I talk about because I have written a full review on the Grounded by the Farm site, so I can link to that here. It is a story of American agriculture that a lot of us have not had a chance to learn from the people whose perspective may be different from ours. So listening to Black farmers talk about here's what their family faced, I will tell you some of the stories are tough. I mean, like when we talked to Mr. Lloyd Johnson a couple of years ago, he told me how when he'd called the bank, he got the loan. They said, just come in and sign the papers. And then when he went in, they made it like they'd never promised that or something, and they didn't give him the loan. Those kind of things have really happened to people, and you will hear it in their own words. And so I think that's why it's really important. With that, I'm going to close this episode out. We will be sharing it on all the social media. Would appreciate your telling friends about it. Actually, this weekend I went to a ball game and Sean had told Jack about the podcast and it brought such a smile to my face. I will tell you, I was so excited. I love it when somebody new finds the show and they either send me a message on the website or social media or, wow, if we happen to meet in person and that's the way I learn, it's incredible. Thanks so much for hearing me out today, and we'll be back with some other farmer interviews in a couple of weeks. Bye.